Hey everyone, this is Mrs. Moriarty and I'm here to discuss with us two topics today in this video with the start of Unit 5. I mentioned in class that this unit is about 17 topics in length, but remember a lot of these topics do kind of go hand in hand with one another. In this video, I'm going to specifically talk about 5.1, Tragedy of the Commons, which is a topic we have previously talked about all the way back in September, so this should be a little bit of a review, as well as 5.11, which is all about ecological footprints, which is a lot of what we focused on today in class. So here taking a look at 5.1, Tragedy of the Commons. A part of the reason why I go over this topic one more time with us is because this is a common theme, a common topic really across a lot of the units that we cover, especially as we move into Unit 6 and Unit 7 and Unit 8 eventually. So remember, when looking at the Tragedy of the Commons, we usually have to look at how, as a human population, do we manage the land that we use, the resources that we obtain, and what are the effects of using all of those. So we know every human use that we're going to do, whether it be maybe building new office buildings, housing, whether or not we need to obtain resources via mining, deforestation, or even altering maybe water, right? Obtaining water from an aquifer or a dam. So we know that really every human use is going to alter the land in which we reside on, right? But we know people don't necessarily always agree on the way land should be used and the management that goes into doing so. So to understand land use and the management issues that undergo all of this, environmental scientists need to consider three concepts, one of them being the tragedy of the commons. Two would be what is an externality, and three, what would be the maximum sustainable yield of whatever resource we are trying to obtain. So what is the tragedy of the commons? Remember, thinking back all the way to Unit 0, we do touch upon this a little bit, and we did our little goldfish lab. Remember where you had a commons of goldfish in order to obtain to feed your family. You had two parts, right? Part 1, remember, was fishing without any regulation, right? No requirements. But part 2, you then had to establish some form of regulations to ensure you didn't totally wipe out your ocean. So here with Tragedy of the Commons, this tells us that individuals will tend to use a shared public resource in their own self-interest rather than keeping with the common good. So what eventually happens is that publicly shared resource becomes depleted. Now, tragedy of the commons is also a result of an economical phenomenon known as a negative externality. This means it is a cost or benefit of a good or service that's not usually included in the purchase or price of that good. And here we can look at to the left, right, here an example of the commons that was proposed by the economist known as Garrett Hardin. If we have, let's say, a land pasture where a bunch of different townspeople, farmers, were bringing their livestock to feed on that then pasture land, here it states the use of the commons is below the carrying capacity of the land at the moment, right? There's not very many livestock or sheep, but if one or more users increases the use of that commons beyond its carrying capacity, the commons becomes degraded. The cost of the degradation is then accrued by all users. That would be a negative externality. And unless environmental costs are taken into account and addressed in the management of this land use, then what's going to happen over time is that land will no longer be able to be used by anyone. So remember that third thing I mentioned that environmentalists need to take into account is what's known as maximum sustainable yield. So when we are trying to obtain a resource, maybe like timber, lumber, fish, and so on, we need to ensure that we have the maximum amount of whatever that renewable resource may be that can be harvested without compromising the future availability of that resource, right? So not overusing it or not over consuming. So here it states in B, every population has a point at which a maximum number of individuals or items can be harvested sustainably. The point is often reached when that population size is about 1/2 of the carrying capacity. So that would be kind of known as your maximum sustainable yield there. So you can see in the graph to the left, here it states, in theory, a population grows at its maximum rate when it is at approximately half of its carrying capacity. Notice how it's actually growing exponentially at this point in time. So if we harvest this substance or this individual or this resource, whatever it may be, if we harvest it at this point, it's going to be better off returning to those numbers each and every time rather than when it approaches carrying capacity. So it's something important to note, especially for like fisheries, when looking at fish populations. If that fish population hits their carrying capacity, their growth is much slower. So if we overharvest, it's going to take a lot more time for them to reach or come back to the original population size they once were. So here's a quick little practice FRQ. You can pause the video at this point and write your FRQ in your FRQ journal and on the Edpuzzle. All right, at this point you should have written your FRQ response in the journal and on the Edpuzzle. So here it states, describe the concept of the tragedy of the commons in the context of a forest ecosystem and identify one solution to the problem above. So with forest ecosystems, typically those are going to be commons, right? Those are usually publicly shared resources. The resource that would be overharvested or maybe overexploited in this case could be timber or lumber, could have even said wildlife as well. But when this publicly shared resource is harvested faster than it can replenish due to the self-gain of those, let's say, harvesters, the overall availability of the resource for any others will be greatly reduced in the future. Now, a solution to the tragedy of the commons can maybe be changing the ownership of the land, maybe making it more privately owned versus publicly shared. We could maybe limit the harvesting of timber or lumber to maybe a singular season, or maybe capping the number of trees that can be harvested per season. You could establish a fee or maybe a charging fee or fine that could also help to maybe regulate the number of trees caught, and if someone goes past that, they're charged. Guys, that brings me to 5.11, and a part of the reason why I like to lump 5.1 and 5.11 together is I feel like they kind of go together. Right? We know Tragedy of the Commons is about using resources for our own self-interest. We talked a lot about the resources that we use today, how frequently we might use them, and how we might even generate waste, right? And how that's going to have environmental impacts. So here looking at specifically populations and their economies, how does that play a role in the resource types that they tend to use? So both population and economic development contribute to the consumption of resources that countries tend to have. Usually, the more developed a country may be, usually the greater number of resources they consume. Many countries tend to exceed the global average footprint of about 1.7 hectares per capita, remember, per person. So how do we measure the amount of resources used? We kind of saw that today using the global footprint calculator, but what they tend to take into account is the country's affluence. Remember, we saw that word back in Unit 3. That refers to a country's wealth, right? The wealthier the country is, the better they can trade goods, sell goods, right? The more money they can draw into the country usually indicates, right, more resources that they're going to use. So that also ties into GDP, or gross domestic product, right? So that's a measure of all the value of products and services that the country produces. So the greater the GDP, the greater the affluence. Now, those items can also be tied to a country's carbon footprint. This measures in tons of CO2 produced per year. So that's usually from like things like transportation or electricity usage. And then we can have ecological footprint, which is going to be a measurement of the individual and how they consume all different types of goods expressed in usually area of land used. So, ways that our ecological footprints can increase, ways they can decrease. Well, when looking at an overall ecological footprint, especially for, let's say, a country such as the United States, China, Germany, and so on, a country is going to increase their footprint whenever they go through those demographic transition stages. Remember, when they eventually get to that stage 4, they are now an industrialized country. They're going to have much greater wealth. Usually that comes with larger houses, traveling farther, going on vacations. That means more resources needed to do all these things. Usually people with greater affluence tend to consume more meat. With more meat consumption comes more land use, more water, more energy to simply just raise the livestock. And then fossil fuel usage to heat your large home or maybe power your car, and so on. So then, what if you want to decrease your footprint? What can you do? Well, if a country, let's say, wants to decrease their footprint, they can reduce their reliance on non-renewable resources such as fossil fuels and maybe switch more to renewable resources like wind, solar, or hydroelectric. As an individual, maybe you could use public transportation, buses, trains, carpool more frequently. What this can do is lessen the amount of fossil fuel or gas used, which can also lessen like your carbon footprint. You can eat a lot less meat. So individuals that are typically vegetarian, vegan, have much less ecological footprints because they're not consuming meat, which requires more land, more water, more energy. And just simply lessening your consumption overall, right? Maybe travel less, maybe shut off the light when you leave the room. So that brings me to our FRQ for 5.11. Here, I want us to identify the 2 largest contributors of Virginia's footprint by consumption, so that's this graph here, and then describe one change that someone living in New York could make to decrease the ecological footprint by land type. So that's over here. So take a moment, answer the FRQ in your FRQ journal, as well as in the Ant Puzzle. All right, taking a look at FRQ-A there, the 2 largest contributors of Virginia's footprint by consumption was housing and personal transportation. And then looking at B, if you take a look at New York by land type and the footprint, it looks like carbon footprint is the largest category there. So that would mean to reduce carbon footprint, then you might want to maybe reduce your reliance on fossil fuels. So you could maybe carpool more with other individuals. You could switch to using more renewable energy resources, or maybe have greater or more energy efficient appliances in your home. All right, everyone, that's it for our video on 5.1 and 5.11. If you have any questions, please leave that at the end of the video.